How do pro jazz musicians solo? Well, there's actually one rule that I hear almost every pro jazz musician break when they're soloing. And unfortunately, when many students learn this rule of improvisation, it ends up making them stuck in their playing and unable to create the types of jazz lines that they want. So in today's lesson, I'm going to show you what this rule is, but more importantly, how you can break it to unlock so many more sounds at your instrument. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so what are these rules that I'm talking about? Well, when you're learning jazz, there are basically three types of chords you're going to use like 99% of the time. You have what's called a major 7 chord, you have what's called a minor 7 chord, and then you have what's called a dominant 7 chord. And there are certain scales that jazz teachers will tell you you can use with each of these chords. For example, on a C major 7, they'll say, hey, you can use the C major scale, and on a C minor 7, you can use the C Dorian scale, and then on a C7 you could use, C Mixolydian scale. And while these are all great scales that you can use when you're improvising, if you listen to most pro musicians improvise, they do not think this way when they're improvising. In fact, they really use an entirely different system of improvisation, which I'm about to show you next. But before we do this, if you're enjoying the video, please hit the like button, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe for more videos just like this. Alright, so what is the system that pro jazz musicians use when they're improvising? Well, guess what? When you hear a pro improvise jazz, they will use any one of the 12 notes on the piano for any of the chords that they're playing. And you might be thinking, Johnny, how is this possible? Can I really use any one of the 12 notes on a C major 7 chord? Yes, you can. Can I use any one of the 12 notes on a minor 7 chord? Yep, you sure can. And you can use all 12 of the notes on a dominant 7 chord as well. So how is this possible? Well, let me show you a quick example. We're going to use a standard chord progression that we use oftentimes in jazz called the 2-5-1. It's like a D minor 7, a G7, and a C major 7. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play all 12 of the notes on the piano on each one of the chords, and you tell me how it sounds. Doesn't that sound cool? And once again, I used every single one of the 12 notes on each one of the chords. This scale is called the chromatic scale, and it uses every single one of the notes at the piano. And the thing is that when a pro jazz musician is soloing, they're actually using this scale to solo. And so that's how they're able to get so many interesting sounds, is because they literally have all of the notes to choose from. And so in a sense, a pro jazz musician is sort of breaking the rules of jazz improv by using all of the notes, when many times students are taught, well, use this scale over this chord. Now you might be thinking, okay, Johnny, so does a pro musician just kind of play any notes, that they want at random? And the answer is no. There's a very specific system that you can use if you want to use the chromatic scale that will help you play very sort of meaningful and intentional lines. So before I teach you this system, I want to quickly review the fingering for the chromatic scale. So if you're playing it in the right hand, I recommend you start on your thumb, then you're going to go index, thumb, index, thumb, index, middle finger, thumb, index, thumb, index, thumb, index, and then middle finger. You can also use the thumb to the middle finger, thumb, middle, thumb, index, middle, thumb, middle, thumb, middle, thumb. Okay, so two ways of doing it: 1-2, 1-2, 1, or 1-3, 1-3, 1. All right, so what is the system that you can use to improvise with the chromatic scale? Well, I call this the neighboring system. And there are basically two techniques that you can use with this neighboring system that will help you create some really cool, interesting jazz lines that feel intentional, and it's not just sort of, randomly going around these chromatic notes. The first technique is called the lower and the upper neighbor technique, and it's actually a very simple idea. If you took the first chord of your 2-5-1 chord progression, your D minor 7 chord, these are called chord tones. And here's the cool thing: each one of these chord tones has a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor. You see that? And then on the F, it has a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor. And then the A has a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor. and the C has a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor. And so when you combine the lower neighbor notes with the upper neighbor notes with all of your chord tones, you actually end up with almost every note from the chromatic scale, except the G, which comes from the D Dorian scale. And so what you can do is you can use these upper and lower neighbors to build really cool lines where you come from a kind of dissonant note and you land on a chord tone or a consonant note. Let me show you an example of this on the D minor 7 chord. Doesn't that sound cool? So what am I doing? Well, I'm playing a D minor 7 chord in my left hand, and in my right hand, I'm starting on the F, and I'm doing this little line. Doesn't that sound nice? Basically, these are all notes from your D Dorian scale, which is all of the white notes on the piano, but I'm using this little G flat to get me to our chord tone F. So this is an upper neighbor. Da, da, da. So it sounds super nice and jazzy. And if you continue this line, right, we've got C sharp, that's a lower neighbor back to the D, right? So look at that one. That's a little upper neighbor to the A, and we're going to extend it to the B and then resolve it down to the A and then to the F, which are chord tones. And so this is how pro jazz musicians use the chromatic scale to create some really cool lines, is by going from these dissonant kind of black notes to these consonant white notes using upper and lower neighbors. Now, there's a little trick that will help you make your lines sound better, in my opinion, and that is you generally want to try to target these chord tones on your primary beats. So beats 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when you're playing jazz, you have 1 and 2 and 3. Try to hit these chord tones on 1, 2, and 3, and generally try to avoid playing them on the ands. All right, before I teach you technique number 2 that you can use with neighbors, if you want to do a deep dive on how to use upper and lower neighbors in your soloing, check out our course 251 Soloing with Upper and Lower Neighbors. In the course, you'll learn several left-hand accompaniments that you can use, some really great exercises to help you master your upper and lower neighbors, plus how to apply this idea to your solo to create some really awesome lines. So I'll put a link to that below. All right, technique number 2 is what's called the enclosure technique, and it's actually a very simple idea. If you take your first chord, D minor 7, we said each of the chord tones has a lower neighbor and an upper neighbor. Well, guess what you can do? You can combine your lower neighbor to your upper neighbor and then resolve it to the chord tone. This is called an enclosure, and basically what I'm doing is I'm enclosing the chord tone by starting on the lower neighbor, upper neighbor, and the final note. I call this a lower enclosure because you're starting on the bottom neighboring note and you're resolving to the note. And so you can do this on all of your chord tones. For the F, you can go lower neighbor, upper neighbor to F, so that's a lower enclosure. Same with the A, lower enclosure, and we resolve it to the C like that. You can also do what's called an upper enclosure, and it's basically the opposite, where I'm resolving to the D, but I'm going upper neighbor, lower neighbor, D, right? And then on the F, on the A, and on the C. So how do you actually use these enclosures in your improvisation? Well, here's a quick example on the D minor 7 chord. Doesn't that sound cool? What I'm basically doing is I'm starting on the A from my D minor 7 chord, I'm walking down and I'm enclosing the F with an upper enclosure. And then I'm going to bring it up and I'm going to do a lower enclosure to the A, and we're going to land there, and then we keep going up to the C, and we're going to enclose the D from the bottom, so a lower enclosure, and we land on the D, and we finish the line with an A, which is a chord tone. All right, next I'm going to show you how you can combine your lower neighbors, upper neighbors, and enclosures on the 2-5-1 chord progression. But before we do that, if you want to do a deep dive on enclosures, you want to learn some different left-hand accompaniments, you want to do exercises to master enclosures, plus you want to see how you can apply enclosures to your solos, then check out our course on enclosures. I'll put a link to that below. All right, in this final part of the lesson, I'm going to show you how you can improvise using all three of these techniques on the 2-5-1. We're going to play with the included backing track, and I'm going to show you some really cool ideas that you can use. By the way, this lesson comes with 4 downloadable backing tracks at different tempos. You can also download the lesson sheet music you're seeing up here on the top left of your screen. Plus, you can change the key of this entire lesson with the click of one button with our smart sheet music. So I'll put a link to all of that below. So here it is with the backing track. We're going to go slowly at about 70 BPM so you can really see what I'm doing. Let's start on that D minor 7 chord. We're using upper neighbors and enclosures. Let's do another one. Be creative with these, okay? Lots of variety. Hey, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the lesson, please let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out pianowithjonny.com. We have over 1,000 step-by-step lessons for all playing levels where you'll learn your favorite songs, styles, and how to improvise at the piano. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.